Hello, and thank you so much for being here. I'm Grace Brailer. I'm a second-year law student and also one of the conference co-directors for this year's conference. It is my distinct honor to introduce to you our next keynoter. I was first introduced to Dr. Richard McLaughlin when he gave a guest lecture about the law of the sea in my oceanography course at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. Dr. McLaughlin will discuss marine animal biologging and its wide-reaching international, legal, and policy implications. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard McLaughlin to the stage.
I'm very happy to be back at PIELC. I was able to attend Norris MacDonald's talk yesterday, where he indicated that it had been 27 years since he was last at PIELC. That got me to thinking, and I was thinking, yeah, when was I last at PIELC? And I did when I was a law professor. I came fairly regularly, but when I thought back on this, that was 20 years ago. And so I'm really very much pleased to be able to come back and to be able to report to everyone that the quality of the conference is as high as it's always been, and it's still, most importantly, free and open to the public. It's one of the only conferences I've ever attended where that has continued for 35 years. So congratulations to everyone who keeps this going and keeps such a high quality. As Grace indicated, what I'm going to be talking about today is the international legal implications of a very popular and quickly growing marine scientific research technique in which you put satellite-based tags on marine animals for various reasons to collect data. I've included this term biologging here because I will be interchangeably kind of using the terms either biologging or satellite-based tagging. So you won't be confused in that regard. Just kind of a way of giving you some context and why I became interested in this particular topic. I have a colleague at the Harte Research Institute, very well-known professor by the name of Dr. Greg Stuntz, who made a presentation maybe 6 or 7 years ago telling us about his research in which he was putting these satellite tags on shark in the Gulf of Mexico, and then kind of monitoring where they travel. And this is what he was talking about. This is a bit of a dated slide, but this is a satellite-based tag. And the way these things work is that you put them on the animals. They continue to collect information for a period of about 6 months, and then they pop off. And they surface, and when they surface, they can then you can upload all of the data that has been collected to a satellite, and then later on analyze that information and use it in the fashion that you want. When Greg kind of told us about this, I asked, is it likely that these animals are going to be moving into either Mexico's or Cuba's national waters? And Greg basically said, sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we assume they'll go into Mexico's waters. It's also likely they might find their way into Cuba's waters. And I said, well, have you gotten permission from either of those nations to do this research in their waters? And he looked at me like I was nuts, like I was crazy. You know, why would I do that? I'd be happy to do it, but why should I? And it dawned on me that either I don't understand the Law of the Sea Convention or he doesn't, and I had to find out which it was. So that kind of got me involved in taking a look at this issue to see what the international legal rules were and whether or not this kind of technology would trigger those international rules. This is Greg. You can barely see him. He's attaching one of these satellite tags to a 10-foot hammerhead shark. Better him than me, for sure. I would not like to be doing this kind of research. And this is one of Greg's sharks. And this is Harvey, the short fin mako shark. He is named because at least some of Greg's sharks that he has tagged he puts on the website, on the Institute's website. So if you're interested in this, I don't think Harvey is still being tracked, but there are various sharks that you can, in real time, find out where they are moving in this Gulf of Mexico region. But clearly Harvey was a international traveler, because you can see that after being tagged somewhere off of Corpus Christi, Texas, he moved definitely through Mexican waters here. He moved into Cuban waters, and it looks like he hitchhiked across Cuba. But I think probably more likely he went this direction. Ended up off the Cayman Islands, off of probably some national waters in the Caribbean, up off of Jamaica, and then back around again. So clearly this showed that absolutely, as Greg had predicted, this information that was being collected on this shark was coming from a number of national waters. This is just to kind of show you some examples of the kinds of tags that we have. You can tag basically any kind of animal that you want, including birds, invertebrates, whatever you want to do. You can find a tag that is useful. In this case, it is a the kind of pop-up electronic tag that I have just described. This is a little different. This is on a sea turtle, and on this particular type of tag, when that sea turtle breaks the surface to breathe, then the information is uploaded to a satellite. Similarly, you can do this on seals as well. What kind of information can you get from these tags? Well, probably the most important information, the information that is in most of the studies using this kind of technology, is location and movement. That's really, I think, what most scientists are trying to find out when they tag these animals. But you can also determine temperature, both external and internal temperature, depth, where they are, for how long, and as a result of all of this, their behaviors in various ways. But even more importantly, and I think more important for the purposes of what we're going to be talking about today, you can also find external environmental properties as a result of these tags. Things like salinity, chlorophyll, dissolved oxygen, and a number of other environmental properties. And the thing to realize is these tags are getting more and more sophisticated. Every year, just like every electronic device that we own, it's becoming more sophisticated. You can get more features on them. You can have more instruments, a suite of instruments attached to the tags. They're becoming more miniaturized, and they're becoming cheaper. And so as a result, clearly this is a technology that is here to stay and is going to be growing in the future. And just to kind of make that clearer, this is a study by McIntyre in 2014 in which he did a survey of the literature. And this only relates to marine mammals. So this is just one segment of the studies using biologging technology. But as you can see, what he found was that after a very slow period, it began in the 1960s, but in the 1990s and at the turn of this century, it began to exponentially increase to the point that by 2013, you have over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles using this technology just for marine mammals alone. And so when you take all of those animals that might have been tagged, we're probably talking in over hundreds of possible studies. Now, where are these studies taking place? Clearly, they're global. Almost everywhere on Earth, we are using this technology to determine locations and other environmental properties. It looks like maybe a hot spot is around here on the west coast of the United States and maybe northeastern coast of the US, as well as maybe in some other areas around Europe. But the point is, it's everywhere. This is a global technology, and they're collecting information globally. This shows a little better example. These are global tracking data sets from around the world. As you can see, you really can't read this. This shows all of the species that have been tagged, and I think you'll have a better, you can read the next slide so that you'll be able to see that a little bit better. But the point is, everywhere on Earth, with maybe the exception of a few remote areas of the South Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, everywhere is being tagged and tracked. Here is a slide of one of the more important of these studies. This is the top study, the tagging of Pacific predator study, which was part of the International Census on Marine Life, which was a decade-long international program that did a number of these studies, but this one employed biologging probably more than any others. And here you can see, if you look at all of the animals that were tagged, here you have a squid. They were tagging squid. I'd really like to see how they did that, but as well as sharks, birds, elephant seals, humpback whales, they tagged almost everything in this study. And the important point that I'd like for you to kind of get from this map is the fact that these animals are moving in and out of various nations' national waters, okay? Through, in, out, around, so that this is clearly a global phenomenon that potentially does have international legal implications. Now, in order to understand those legal implications, it's probably good for those of you that don't know about the International Law of the Sea Convention, the United Nations, 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I'd like to kind of explain what I believe, and I think what a lot of my colleagues believe, is the most important international, multilateral international treaty that has ever been negotiated. Now, why do I say that? I say it because every nation on Earth participated in the negotiations. Even nations that don't have coastlines, landlocked nations. Every nation in the 1970s, when this was going on, participated and they were at the table. In addition, all decisions were made based on consensus, which is an extraordinarily rare thing. Normally, in international multilateral negotiations, you use supermajorities. If you can get, 3/4 of the delegates to agree on something, then it's incorporated into the treaty. In this case, in this negotiation, every word in that treaty had to be agreed upon by every nation on Earth. And as a consequence, and the reason why you don't have consensus negotiations very often, is because they take forever. I mean, it took 10 continuous years, 24/7 basically, in order to complete this treaty. Now, the importance of the fact that every nation on Earth agreed to every word in the convention was the fact that it created what is known as instantaneous customary law. The importance of customary law is that even if you're not a state party to this treaty, you still are bound by the provisions because they are part of customary law. Now, there are, some exceptions to that, but for purposes of our discussion today, even those nations that are not party to the convention have agreed to be bound by the scientific research provisions that I'll be talking about. And most importantly among that group is, of course, the United States. Because as most of you know, the United States still is not a party to the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. It's the bane of my professional career. I've been working for 35 years to try to convince whoever would listen to me that the United States should become a party to this convention. 168 nations are parties to the convention, including every developed nation on Earth, and there are 190, 192 nations, something like that. So, this is almost every single nation on Earth, and yet we have not acceded. And I don't want to talk any more about it. If you want to talk about it more during the question and answers, that's fine. But the point is, what I will be talking about today, the United States has publicly agreed that they will be bound by those provisions, even if they're not parties to the Law of the Sea Convention. And it did enter into force in 1994, even without the United States as a party. Okay, just a quick primer on the Law of the Sea Convention, just so that everyone sort of understands where I'm coming from when I start talking about the specific provisions. The way the Law of the Sea Convention is constructed is it creates a series of offshore juridical zones from the coastline of nations all the way out into the middle of the ocean. And the general thread that runs through the conference is that those activities in areas closer to shore are authorized to those coastal nations. In other words, coastal nations have most of the legal authority closer to shore, and as you move further and further out into the ocean, then the international community begins to have more and more legal authority. And so, I mean, that just makes, I think, common sense. And so the way that they have done this is by creating these series of juridical zones, starting with internal waters. Internal waters are those areas that are landward of the low tide line. So we're really talking about bays and estuaries. In bays and estuaries, every coastal nation has absolute and complete authority to do whatever it wants. It's the same authority as they have on land. They can prevent foreign parties from doing anything in internal waters. When you move to the next zone, the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, you also have almost complete authority to prevent any kind of activity that you choose to prevent, with one exception. And that one exception is the innocent passage of foreign flag vessels. You have to allow foreign vessels to transit through the territorial sea as long as they don't stop, as long as they don't fish, as long as they don't engage in marine scientific research or something else, as long as they're just innocently passing through. But other than that, you can stop them from doing anything in the territorial sea. The next zone is the contiguous zone, which is from 12 to 24. That takes away a few of those rights from coastal nations, but it doesn't have anything directly to do with the marine research issue that we're going to be talking about, so we won't worry about the contiguous zone at this point. The next one, though, however, this 200-mile exclusive economic zone, is the crown jewel of the Law of the Sea Convention, if there is such a thing. It created a legal regime in which the coastal nation, the adjacent coastal nation, has the exclusive authority to explore and exploit the living and non-living natural resources within that 200-mile limit, and to prevent foreign interests from doing anything if it chooses not to allow it. So that's why it's called the economic zone, the 200-mile economic zone. If it's economically related, and clearly using natural resources is economically related, then the coastal nation has authority, exclusive authority over it. If it's not economic related, if it's things like military activities or international navigation, it's still viewed as the high seas, and there are freedom of the seas attached to it. So it's a hybrid zone. But for our purposes, marine scientific research can clearly be regulated under some circumstances in the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and I'll explain that in just a moment. The other two zones, the extended continental shelf and the international waters, are again important, but not really important to the issue that we're talking about today, so we'll let that pass as well. Okay, so how is marine scientific research regulated under the Law of the Sea Convention? Article 246 is the primary provision, and what it basically says is that marine scientific research by state shall only be conducted with the consent of the coastal state, and coastal states shall, in normal circumstances, grant their consent. So what it's basically saying is that you do have the authority to require permission whenever a foreign party wants to engage in marine scientific research in your waters. And you should normally grant it under most circumstances. And we encourage you to do it. We want this marine scientific research to occur. But there are specific instances, exceptions to that. And those exceptions are included right here. That at their discretion, coastal states can withhold consent to conduct MSR within the exclusive economic zone if, and then this is the one I want to focus on. These I don't think are as important. If it is of direct significance for the exploration or exploitation of living or non-living natural resources. So in other words, if it falls within what you would normally give exclusive authority to the coastal nation over in the exclusive economic zone. So if you can show that this marine scientific research has some significance to these natural resources, then you can flat out prohibit any nation from engaging in any marine scientific research at that time. In addition, it's very important to note that the convention doesn't treat marine scientific research as only research, kind of traditional oceanographic research from vessels. They made it very clear in Article 258, and this is important, so I'm going to read this quoted language. The deployment and use of any type of scientific research installations or equipment in any area of the marine environment shall be subject to the same conditions as are prescribed in this convention for the conduct of marine scientific research in any such area. So they wanted to make it very clear that they were not talking about only traditional oceanographic research from vessels. That even in the 1970s, when this was negotiated, they knew that there were things like floating buoys and there were seabed arrays, sensor arrays, and there were all kinds of things that weren't vessels that had to be regulated under these provisions. And they made it very clear that that is what they were intending to do. And finally, they put provisions in kind of a process to make sure that these coastal nations could make an informed decision. That you provide the nations with detailed information pertaining to the nature, objective, timing, and location of whatever research you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish with that research. And you have to do it within 6 months in advance of when you actually plan to do that research. And the point of this is to make sure that the coastal nations have an opportunity to determine whether they can use one of those exemptions, whether there is, for example, a direct significance to the exploration or exploitation of natural resources. The only way to do that is to give them appropriate information and enough time for them to make sure that they can consent or not consent in an informed fashion. Okay, given that legal summary of the Law of the Sea Convention, I wanted to determine whether or not any of the studies that I saw that were engaging in biologging and in the use of these satellite tags, whether they did or did not have significance, direct significance to natural resources. And I did a kind of a down and dirty cursory search of the literature to see what kinds of things these studies were trying to accomplish. And what I found was, first and again, I think the most frequent use of this information was to discover basic behavior, migration corridors, and habitat use. That's what most of these studies are trying to accomplish. But they were also, for example, trying to locate feeding hotspots in nursery areas. They were examining incidental take in fisheries. They were using this information to determine where marine mammals were moving in order to guide the behavior of oil and gas development. In other words, tagging things like whales and marine mammals to determine that if they are traveling in this migration corridor at this time of the year, then you should probably stop any kind of air gun use or explosive use or anything else that could harm those animals at that time of the year. So that was I saw that in several of these studies. And also one that kind of surprised me was you can locate underwater temperature and salinity corridors of value in anti-submarine warfare. There are things known as thermoclines that I guess submarines can be camouflaged. If you can find these thermoclines, then you can use it in anti-submarine warfare. So these studies even had some national security implications. So the point of all of this, and there were a bunch of others, this is a very cursory examination. Here is one that I'd like to use to just show you an example of what I'm talking about, where there could absolutely be direct significance to these natural resources. This is a relatively early study by Stewart and DeLong in 1994. And what they did in this study was to tag northern elephant seals at their nursery area down here off of Santa Barbara, off the Southern California coast. They then wanted to find out where the elephant seals were traveling when they weren't in the nursery areas, and this is what they discovered, that they were moving around in the northern Pacific and congregating in certain areas. And they didn't know at first why they were congregating in these areas. They went back and did additional research and some ground truthing and found out it was because that's where the food was. What they were going up there is they were eating squid, and this is where the aggregation of squid was located. Now, if you're Canada or the United States, this kind of thing probably doesn't bother you. We have real good control over our offshore areas, and we tend to want to encourage all marine scientific research. But just transfer this study to maybe one of the South Pacific island nations, or the nations on the west coast of Africa, which depend on negotiating foreign fishery access agreements for a good chunk of their annual revenue, their annual treasury, and tell me that they wouldn't be perhaps upset that everyone knows exactly where some of their fish stocks are located. This is what I mean when I say you've got to kind of look at the international legal implications of this and determine whether or not at some point there could be a crisis of some kind, a problem that would cause obstacles or barriers to the continued use of this kind of technology, and we have to be sensitive to that. Okay, having said that and kind of explained where I'm coming from and what my thesis is, what my argument is, I've made this kind of presentation at several conferences in the past, primarily legal conferences, but in some cases to both lawyers and to scientists. And the general feeling I have gotten after leaving those presentations is the lawyers generally support it, my argument, and like it, and the scientists hate it with a passion. Because, of course, it creates additional obstacles and difficulties for them to do the work, the important work that they want to do. There was one exception to that, and I very much appreciate this exception, but a friend of mine, James Kraske, who is a professor at the Naval War College in, where is that, in Rhode Island? He wrote, and a couple of his students wrote a commentary in Marine Policy Journal refuting my argument. This was after we had kind of a discussion at a conference similar to this. And I then, 6 months later, wrote a rebuttal to his commentary. And what I'd like to do is to just kind of go through the points that he made, because I have a feeling they're the same points you're thinking right now. And this might be a way to clear this up a little bit, or not, but at least it will, I think, answer maybe a few questions that might be on your minds as well as on Kraske's mind. The first thing that he argued, and this is the argument that I think is on everyone's mind, on my mind as well, and that is, how can you require coastal nation consent for this kind of research when animals are unpredictable. I mean, you're not talking about a vessel where you know pretty much where it will be at any moment and you can plan accordingly. When you have these instruments on animals, these are autonomous creatures, they have their own brains, they can travel where they want to travel. And you can't predict where they will be 6 months from now. My response to that is yes and no. There are perhaps some animals that we don't know anything about, that we really don't have a clue as to where they might travel. However, I think the more we are doing this kind of research, the less realistic that view is. And in fact, a real kind of trend right now is trying to predict where those animals will be at any time, using all of the data that we have received over the last decade or two to do that. And in fact, there are two recent studies, very important studies, Harrison et al. And Rooker et al. Harrison was maybe 6 months ago it was published. Rooker maybe 3 weeks ago it was published, very new. And what I would like to do is just kind of show you what this research looks like. This is the Harrison study, and Harrison was part of the top program. And as you can see, basically this is the same map that I showed you. And what she did was, she and her colleagues took the data that they received from this program and overlaid it over the 200-mile exclusive economic zones in the same region in order to try to project the probabilities that animals would be located in these 200-mile exclusive economic zones. And this is an example of what that group came up with. These are Pacific bluefin tuna, and what they found out was that, at least for this particular species, that if you were looking between January and July, there was between an 80 and 100% chance that that bluefin tuna would be within the Mexican 200-mile exclusive economic zone. It drops in August and then goes back up again in the winter. It moves into US waters. But nobody can tell me that it's unreasonable if you have an 80 to 100% chance that a particular animal will be moving through a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, that you can't make sure that Mexico consents and participates in that scientific study. All right? This is not rocket science. It's not even hard marine biology. I can even figure this out, and I generally can't figure marine biology out. So, in some cases, clearly, it's much more complex and more difficult than that. This is the same study. This is off of Australia and Southeast Asia and sea turtles. And you can see in this case, the probabilities are all, I mean, it's a more complex geopolitical system right there, and it's more difficult, I think, than it would be under the previous example, but it's not impossible, and you know generally where these animals are going to be moving in a general sense. Rooker basically did the same thing, only did it in the Gulf of Mexico. Rooker looked at large pelagic fish, mapped them first, and then developed these probability tables. So, to give you another example, this one right here is a whale shark. And clearly, if you're talking about the winter months and whale sharks, there is about a 90% chance, once again, that that whale shark will be in Mexican national waters in the 200-mile zone of Mexico during the winter months. Once again, not rocket science to say, if you're tagging these animals in the winter months and there's a 90% chance they're going to be in Mexico, then bring them in. Bring them in and make sure that you comply as best you can with the regime in the Law of the Sea Convention. Now, in contrast to that, this C is a scalloped hammerhead shark. Clearly, this is an animal that stays within the U.S. 200-mile zone. It doesn't move, it doesn't migrate like the others. No point. You don't have to worry about it under those circumstances. But again, I think this argument that these are totally random, actions by these autonomous creatures is not accurate. We know in almost every instance approximately where a lot of these animals will be traveling. Not absolutely, but approximately. Okay, so that's the first argument. Second argument that he made is that coastal state consent is not required because the data received remotely by biologging is not as intrusive as traditional MSR and should be treated similarly to other forms of remote sensing. What this argument basically means is, unlike 150 or 200-foot oceanographic vessels plowing through your 200-mile zone where it's really intrusive what they're doing, when you have these animals that are moving through the water collecting data surreptitiously, you really don't even know they're there, that they should be treated similarly to how we treat remote sensed images from space. Okay, that's also a very unintrusive kind of technology. And the argument is that in the case of remote sensing, we've developed something called an open skies doctrine, which is pretty much hands-off. That we've come to the conclusion that you can't force nations to stop remote sensing unless you get permission from the land or sea territory that you're imaging from space. Now here's the thing, and that is that decision came about as a result of years of discussions and negotiations and state practice. Okay, this is a classic example of a situation in which the technology outpaced the legal regime that could control that technology. And what happened was, over a period of time, these nations presented with this started engaging in discussions and negotiations and other kinds of activities, and came to the consensus over a period of time that the open skies doctrine was appropriate. They couldn't do anything better. That's not the case with this. Okay, this is very different. It has a very specific treaty. Unlike the remote sensing analogy, this treaty specifically deals with marine scientific research and puts specific controls on how you deal with it. So clearly, I don't think this is a very persuasive argument as well. The last argument that he made was that the activity, meaning for purposes of determining consent under the marine scientific research provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention, is at the point where the animal is tagged, not at the location where the data is collected. In other words, his argument was, it is marine scientific research, but it's when you collect that animal and place a tag on it. At that point, you need consent from the coastal nation. But once you release that animal and it begins to move on its own and collect data all over the world, that's no longer marine scientific research, and therefore doesn't require consent. Now, my response to that is that completely ignores Article 258. Okay? 258 specifically says that we're not talking about vessels. We're talking about anything where you are collecting information, collecting scientific data or information in another nation's exclusive economic zone. So it really strikes me, I don't think you can get around the obligations in the convention by collecting your animal outside of a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, knowing that when you release it, it's likely going to collect information within that 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and therefore you don't have to comply with the provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention. So again, my view is not persuasive, and I'm still comfortable with what I'm arguing. Now, I'm also comfortable. I'm not entirely in left field here. I'm not way out in left field. I may be in shallow left field, but I'm not way out there because there are other examples that are basically making the same argument. And this is one of those examples. There is a program, some of you are probably aware because it's one of the primary research programs to determine climate change and how the oceans affect climate change. And this is the Integrated Global Observation Strategy. It's a huge program that's been in place for 10 or 15 years. If you didn't know this, there are 3,000 to 3,500 of these floating buoys in the oceans collecting data. Right now, as we speak, they're out there collecting data. And this is what they're doing. They're basically surfacing and uploading the data from the buoy. They then sink to a certain depth. They drift for a certain period of time. They then are pre-programmed to drop to another profiling depth, and then they begin to collect data as they ascend to the surface, salinity, temperature, and other forms of data. And then they upload that to the satellite and then move on to the next location 10 hours later. That's the system. Some nations made the same argument I'm making, and that is, and this was led by Peru and Argentina, making the argument that these floating instruments that drift into their EEZs and are collecting information should be subject to the Law of the Sea Convention, and they should have some ability to consent to what kind of information is collected in those areas. As you can imagine, the United States and some other nations objected to that and said, you know, we consider this kind of information to be what is known as operational oceanography, routine measurements that we use to predict weather, to predict, you know, oceanographic conditions and other things. This should not be subject to the Law of the Sea Convention. What ended up happening was that the International Oceanographic Commission, which is the sponsoring agency, developed some non-binding guidelines that were a compromise. Basically allowing nations that were concerned to require or request in writing that they be informed whenever one of these floating instruments moves into their 200-mile exclusive economic zone. And at that point, once they have the information, they can then make a determination of whether the data is of direct significance for their natural resources, which is the requirement under the Law of the Sea Convention. And if they make that determination, they can request that it not be distributed to the public. Now, they've agreed to be part of this program, so you can still use the data. You just can't release it to the public, which all of this data that's being collected under the Argo program is automatically released to the public. And you can, any of you could have access to it if you just go onto their website. Now, having said that, only Argentina has officially requested to be notified. So it hasn't become a huge issue, but it sets a precedent. And it clearly indicates to me that I'm not crazy, that this is something that is on not just my mind as kind of a, you know, ivory tower academic type, but it's on actual minds of people that are working in this daily. So what do we do next? First, I want to make it absolutely crystal clear that I in no way am advocating putting barriers or obstructions to biologging. I think it's some of the most important scientific research we could ever do. And we have to make sure that it continues. And my fear is the exact opposite. My fear is that some crisis will come up, some focusing event will occur that will place the kinds of constraints and barriers on this technology that we don't want. And so that's why I'm advocating the kind of discussion we're having today and to come to some consensus on this. It's not because I don't like biologging. I think it's fantastic and we should continue to do it. In addition, I also don't think that strict compliance with the Law of the Sea Convention is feasible. I mean, clearly there is no way that you can require 6 months formal notice every time some animal might move into your 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So Point being, you know, we need compromise. We need a robust discussion here and nothing more at this point. But this is clearly a classic case in which technology is outpacing legal rules, similar to what I mentioned with remote sensing, similar to the situation we probably have now with the social media issue, right? Fake news, releasing private data to third parties. It's where technology moves to a point that's further than the legal system is in controlling it. And as a consequence, we have to catch up. We have to do what's necessary to address the issue before something really bad happens in the future. Now, there is an example I can point out that I think might be something that is worth emulating. And that is the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, also known as ICAT. It's a international regional fisheries organization that is made up of all of these nations that surround the Atlantic Ocean. All of the shaded nations are part of ICAT. And what they have done since 2015 is to create a tagging program that is quite ambitious. This is the program. They are trying to target 120,000 tuna to be tagged in this study. They've already tagged 50,000. And what they are using is a combination of traditional tags, also known as passive tags. These are not the kind of tags I've been talking about. These are just basically strips of plastic that you attach to a fish. And when that fish is caught somewhere in another part of the world, whoever catches the fish will contact the researcher, and you will know then that that fish has moved from point A to point B. But in addition to that passive tagging, they're also doing electronic tagging, the kind of tagging that we've been talking about today. And what they have done is to bring all of the nations in the region together to agree to it and also to engage in training sessions, outreach and education for the fishers in those regions, in those countries, and everyone is working cooperatively in order to achieve this. And it really accomplishes, you know, exactly what I believe should be accomplished. We could clearly do something like this in the Gulf of Mexico, where we have a much smaller group of nations. And, you know, this kind of collaborative activity is probably the best we can hope for. Another option is to do nothing, and that's the most likely option. It generally is. If we do nothing, then the problem is and I'm saying if, I'm not saying it absolutely will occur, but if a crisis comes up of some kind that triggers a reaction, a political reaction or a legal reaction, then all of a sudden all of the policy choices that we have are very much limited. Whenever you have a crisis scenario, then all of a sudden, you know, political issues, alliances, legal defense strategies and other things come into play, and you simply can't address it in as wise a fashion as you can when you're not in that crisis situation. So my hope is that we don't get to that point, that we instead, someone will take this on and we'll have a robust enough discussion to maybe develop best practices, guides, or something else that will address this issue. And with that, here are the sources. I know all of you, if you're really gluttons for punishment and want to dig even deeper into this, deeper than my, hour and 50 minutes? How long have I been talking? 50 minutes? So I'm okay. I would recommend you taking a look at these sources. And I would like to, again, acknowledge PIELC. I'd like to acknowledge my own institute, the Harte Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies, and NOAA's CCME program for the support that they've provided. And with that, thank you, and I will answer any questions, and we can talk about it further. Everybody.
Professor, my question was, what was the United States' major reason for rejection of the treaty?
America first. Yeah, I mean, as all of you know, in order to ratify a treaty under our Constitution, you need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify. So it has always been trying to convince all but 34 or whatever senators to go along with this, and we have never been able to get past the concern that a small but influential constituency of the Republican Party has in opposing anything relating to the United Nations and anything that might, in their view, relinquish US sovereignty. And so that's the problem with the Law of the Sea Convention, is that it not only was negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations, which is one strike against it, you know, and the other is that it has provisions, dispute settlement provisions. There's compulsory dispute settlement provisions. Now, to be honest, they're nowhere near as difficult to avoid as the opponents argue, but that's the argument. The argument is we don't need to be a party to the convention. We have all of the benefits of the customary legal regime that provides us basically with all of the rights that we want, and we don't have any of the obligations to, for example, be pulled in front of a dispute settlement tribunal in some way in order to defend any action that we take. So that's basically the argument. The problem is that we've come close to getting the 2/3 several times over the last 30 years. The most recently was kind of in the first term, I think, of Obama, of the Obama administration, where he really pushed it. But we, you know, immediately something like 34 senators put out a letter saying they would not agree to ratify, and that was the end of that. So in short, it's the Republican Party that's stopping it.
Thank you.
I'll get to you.
Has this kind of research been used for tracking marine litter globally, how plastic and other items that come off the land drift into the ocean?
Wow, that's interesting. You mean attach tags to debris, to litter?
Bottles and other things that is, or I mean there are ways to do it. Any kind of non-living items that leave the shores and where they congregate.
I can't answer that question. I mean, it's a great question. And it may be, for those of you, I don't know if we have any scientists out there, but that might be, you know, something that we should consider. I haven't seen anything in the literature. I mean, I do know that they use things like not attaching tags to debris or to litter, but basically you accomplishing sort of the same thing by finding out where that litter would likely move by using, you know, traditional floating buoys and other kinds of techniques in order to just determine if litter or if debris occurs here, where will it likely end up in the future. They have modeling, they have other ways to determine that. So it may or may not be effective, but it's worth considering. I don't know. I haven't seen anything. The same laws would not apply, in my view. Once again, what triggers the ability of the coastal nation to not agree to the marine scientific research is its direct significance to natural resources, the development of natural resources. If you were to put these tags onto marine debris and just basically see where they're moving, unless those tags were also collecting a bunch of additional data that could in some way or another be viewed as directly affecting natural resources, then it wouldn't be the same. My argument is that, you know, a lot of this information is directly related to stocks of fish that have economic value to these nations. Or I can give you another scenario. Even the scenario that I gave you where a whale was tagged and it was whales were tagged, a number of them, and it was determined that they were moving through a certain section of a nation's 200-mile exclusive economic zone at a certain time of year. And as a result of that information being publicly released, pressure is put on that nation to not engage in oil and gas development in that location because it might be too detrimental to marine mammals. That in and of itself, now I know all of us in this room think probably that's a good thing to know, and we should encourage that. But when you're from the perspective of the coastal nation, that wants, especially if it's a poor developing coastal nation that wants to develop that resource, that might be the kind of crisis or trigger that I'm talking about. So it could happen under any scenario, potentially. But that, I haven't thought about the one that you just mentioned, but who knows? I think the gentleman, yes, I think you were next.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'm curious if there's a special sort of set of protocols for handling the information, protecting the information, and if as a result of the settling the treaty, did that kind of flow develop? And also I found myself looking at the issue of whether why would Argentina not agree or become the only one to agree, and I thought possibly it had something to do with Britain and the Falkland Islands War during that period, and I just wonder if in exploring the ways in which the research is made available, even years post the actual development of the information, if you've seen signs of control of that research continuing across international years.
Yeah. Of course, there are requirements, even if you consent to research in your 200-mile zone. You can require that they release that information, that scientific data, to your nation, and you also can require that your scientists participate in that scientific research project. So even if you're agreeing to allow them to engage in that research, there are some restrictions and some conditions, not restrictions, but conditions that you can impose. And there is nothing that would prevent a nation, as long as they can argue that there is direct significance to a natural resource, there's nothing that would prevent them from making sure that that information is kept secret, kept private, and not released publicly. Other than that, the concern that I see is that most scientists absolutely will not engage in research unless they can make it openly accessible. In other words, unless they can publish their results. And so I think that would be a matter of, working something out between the nation itself and the researchers, which is very commonly done. And if, for example, the nation refuses to allow you to publicly disseminate that information, then you simply don't do the research, okay? Now, in regards to Argentina, Argentina has always, like Mexico, to be honest, Mexico and Argentina have been leaders, traditionally leaders in making sure that the developing nations' concerns are safeguarded, and very specifically relating to marine scientific research. And it could have something to do with the Falklands and other kinds of issues, I'm not sure. But I do know that Argentina seems to always be at the forefront of this concern of international scientific groups coming in and plundering and pillaging developing nations' exclusive economic zones for scientific purposes. And they want to make sure always that the rights and protections under the Law of the Sea Convention are protected. And so I don't know whether I answered your question or not. Yeah, if not, then we can talk about it afterwards.
We've been asked to reduce the mobility of the handheld mic, so if anybody with questions wouldn't mind coming up to the mic stand, Dr. McLaughlin can continue to respond.
So let me guess that global corporations and global finance don't want to have more research into the decline of species and the deterioration of the oceans in general. So do you see any evidence of any sort of pressure developing to tighten up the ability to do research in the ocean? Just for the purpose of making it harder for the global population to document the decline of the oceans?
I think there's kind of a dichotomy between the work that's done by private corporations, and there is an awful lot of work that's done by private corporations, including, you know, the Exxons and the oil companies of the world and others, in which there is a real premium on keeping that secret and not releasing it and using it only for their purposes. And also, for example, making sure that if you contract scientists to come in and work on a particular project, that you have a non-disclosure agreement in place that would allow them, for example, to edit any final research that comes out. Now, I can tell you that most scientists would absolutely refuse to participate in research of that kind. And, you know, when it comes to the academic scientific community and, you know, just generally the global scientific community, they, you know, are adamantly opposed to exactly what you're talking about. And I don't think that there's any, other than the obvious concerns about, for example, reporting on climate change and some other things that are directly related to certain priorities of nations or certain corporate priorities, I don't think there's any way they can prevent it from occurring. So to answer your question, in some cases, yes, if it's, and in fact, if there's one thing scarier to these nations that I've talked about than to release where their fish stocks are located to some scientific journal that everyone can read, what's scarier is if a fishing consortium did that research privately and they were the only ones that knew the information. That's even more dangerous, because then they have the information and all of the rest of the world doesn't. So to answer your question, I think it's potentially under some circumstances a problem, but I don't see a general, you know, trend toward limiting marine scientific research.
Global corporations, fishing company, you know, these entities want to have a continued open access to research of this nature. So my guess is wrong. It's 180% out of phase.
Yeah, I think so.
So I guess my question is, when you have a coastal state, maybe there's an example that's maybe no one's tried yet, but if you have that researcher who knows that the tuna is like 80% chance it's going to be in Mexican waters,
yeah,
and they only really need to tag one or two, but they tag, let's say, 100 or more. Is there, and the intent is blatant in that they're trying to get information from the waters of that state. Is that something that's happened at all, or is there any risk of that affecting the current legal setup?
You're basically saying they commit fraud? I mean, in other words, they tell the coastal nation they're going to tag a certain number, but they tag a lot more? Is that what you mean? Or? They just do it.
Up, like Mexico says, hey, this research being done in the U.S., they know that these tuna are going to be in our waters at this time, and they tag a hell of a lot of them, and it's obvious that this is what they're trying to do is get information from our waters. Is that possible within the legal setup as it is? Does that make a risk of clamping down on and then ruining actual, legitimate scientific research?
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly the concern I have. That's exactly the concern. And that is that for some, you know, and again, we can only speculate what might happen, but something triggers a intense political response from some nation because they discover something has occurred and they don't want it to occur again. And if they were to do that, then there are, at least at this point, what they could do, for example, and what I'm assuming, if it was not the United States, they could actually bring a dispute settlement claim in the Law of the Sea Convention. Because this is the kind of thing, and to be honest, I kind of would love to see that. And the reason is it would give some certainty to, I mean, we'd begin then to develop, you'd have a tribunal or an arbitration panel or something decide this issue. because you could do that. I mean, the point is that that is not one of those kinds of activities that does not fall within the compulsory dispute settlement provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention. So if Mexico did have that concern and felt that they were circumventing the rules, they were trying to take advantage of the situation and collect data that they knew they couldn't collect if they'd actually asked Mexico for permission, then that's exactly the concern I have, is they could then blow this up into a political issue, and all of a sudden all bets are off, because at that point you don't know how it's going to end up. I think it would be much better if Mexico understood the potential problem and contacted colleagues in other countries and said, let's figure this out. Let's develop some kind of compromise, best practices, set of guidelines, so that we don't have to deal with this in the future. We don't have to be concerned about the kind of situation that you brought up. But absolutely, that could occur. Yep.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, in terms of the close consent of coastal nations, whether or not indigenous communities were considered to have a seat at the table with regards to that consent, or how their voices were being brought in.
They were, I think they had observer status, but they were viewed, again, this is kind of traditional international law, and they are represented by their sovereign government. And so it was simply whatever they were able to work out with their own government representatives. In some cases, they, I'm sure, had a very strong seat at the table and had a lot of influence with a particular government. In other cases, they were probably totally ignored. So, you know, to answer your question, no. Other than having perhaps observer status or some influence with each of the sovereign parties, they did not have a seat at the table. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that your colleague doing this work was surprised when you asked
Yep.
if this was an important issue.
Still is surprised.
Right.
He still won't listen to me.
It's like we're dealing with a world here where there are the people who follow the rules and are interested in developing the rules. But what would keep a private company that does major, you know, industrial scale fishing from just doing what they want? I mean,
Yep.
there's nothing to stop that, is there?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, if what you're saying is something similar to what the kind of, you know, hypothetical scenario that I raised, if you were a big fishing conglomerate and you wanted to pay scientists to tag all kinds of fish, knowing that they were going to go into an area and perhaps provide you with information that would help you in negotiating an agreement, a fisheries access agreement with that nation, there's nothing that would, at this point, that would prevent you from doing that. Other than the fact that there would be a potential, you know, stink, a potential political blow up if you were caught doing it. You know, if someone actually, a whistleblower, brought it to the public's attention. But, and I don't know whether that's going on or not. Those of you that know more about the fishing industry might know. I don't know whether that's going on, but it certainly could. And that's my fear, is that kind of thing could happen unless you come to some agreement on